In the autumn of 1953, two men signed a quiet piece of paper in Madrid, and the act would echo through 70 years of history. A fascist dictator, shunned by the entire civilized world after the Second World War, shook hands with the world's newest superpower. Spain, a nation exiled, boycotted, and left for dead by the United Nations itself, became, almost overnight, indispensable to American strategy. How did the United States justify embracing the last fascist regime standing in Europe? And how did that uneasy bargain evolve, through coups, referendums, wars, and missile shields, into one of NATO's most complex modern partnerships, only to fracture, in the most unexpected way, generations later? This is the story of Spain and the United States, a strategic marriage of convenience that nearly ended in 2026 over a war fought thousands of miles from either capital. The story begins not in 1953, but 8 years earlier, in the smoking ruins of a Europe that wanted nothing to do with Francisco Franco. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the victorious Allied powers had little patience for the Spanish dictator who had supplied Hitler's war machine with raw materials, sent the Volunteer Blue Division to fight alongside the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and built his regime with direct military assistance from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Spain had stayed formally neutral during the war, but no one in Washington, London, or Moscow believed that neutrality had been anything but a calculation of convenience. In December 1946, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the Franco regime and recommending that member states withdraw their ambassadors from Madrid. Spain was excluded from the Marshall Plan, the enormous American Reconstruction program that was rebuilding the rest of Western Europe. It was barred from the fledgling North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949 to unite the democracies of the West against Soviet expansion. For a regime that had fought a brutal civil war from 1936 to 1939 and built its legitimacy on anti-communism, this exclusion from the anti-communist alliance was a bitter irony. Franco was, in the eyes of Washington, the wrong kind of anti-communist, a fascist relic rather than a democratic partner. But history rarely stays still, and the Cold War was reshaping every calculation in Washington. The detonation of the first Soviet atomic bomb in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, transformed American strategic thinking almost overnight. Containment of communism, not the moral rehabilitation of post-war Europe, became the organizing principle of American foreign policy. Strategists at the Pentagon began looking at a map of Europe and noticing something they could not ignore: Spain occupied one of the most valuable pieces of geography on the continent. It controlled access to the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Its mainland could serve as a secure rear base for American forces if the Red Army ever surged across Central Europe, far from the front lines of any Soviet offensive. And the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa, offered a commanding position over a vast stretch of the Atlantic. Strategically, Spain was a fortress that the United States desperately wanted to lease. The opening moves toward rapprochement came carefully, almost reluctantly. In July 1951, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations traveled to Madrid to meet personally with Franco, and the two reached a preliminary understanding on military cooperation. Formal negotiations began in April 1952. The American delegation was led by General August Kistner on military matters and George Train on economic questions, while Spain's delegation was headed by General Juan Viggen. Washington's early reluctance to formally embrace Franco's dictatorship softened considerably after the election of Dwight Eisenhower as president in 1952. Eisenhower, the former supreme Allied commander in Europe, understood the cold logic of basing rights better than most, and his administration appointed James Dunn as ambassador to Madrid, a diplomat notably more flexible than his predecessor in accepting the terms Franco's government wanted. The negotiations culminated on September 23, 1953, when representatives of the two governments signed what would become known as the Pax of Madrid in the Spanish capital. Despite the name, this was not a single treaty but three separate executive agreements, each addressing a different dimension of the new relationship. The first dealt with the provision of American war material to the depleted and outdated Spanish armed forces, which were still relying heavily on Italian and German equipment left over from the Spanish Civil War. The second agreement covered economic aid, including loans administered largely through the U.S. Export-Import Bank, to be used for purchasing American goods such as food, cotton, petroleum, and coal. The third and most consequential agreement authorized the United States to develop, maintain, and use military facilities on Spanish soil, jointly with the Spanish government, wherever both nations' military authorities deemed necessary. Crucially, Spain had requested that these arrangements take the form of formal treaties, which would have required ratification and carried the weight of a true alliance commitment. The United States declined. These were executive agreements, renewable but not binding in the way a mutual defense treaty would be, a structural choice that would generate friction for decades, as Spanish leaders gradually came to feel they had signed on to a relationship of obligation without ever receiving the reciprocal guarantee of an alliance. Over the following decade, the practical results of the Pax reshaped the Spanish landscape. 5 major American military installations rose across the country, for air bases at Moron, near Seville, Zaragoza, in the northeast, Torrejón de Ardoz, on the outskirts of Madrid, and San Pablo, along with the naval station at Rota, on the Atlantic coast near Cadiz. Around 7,000 American military personnel and their families settled into these bases, alongside smaller surveillance and communications sites scattered from Constantina to Soler. Between 1953 and 1963, Spain received more than $1.5 billion in American economic aid and approximately $456 million worth of second-hand military equipment, including M47 and M48 Patton tanks and M24 Chaffee light tanks, modernizing an army that had limped along for years on Civil War surplus. For the Franco regime, the diplomatic payoff arrived almost immediately. The pact functioned as a kind of international rehabilitation certificate. Western ambassadors who had withdrawn from Madrid in protest began returning. Spain was admitted to specialized United Nations agencies, and on December 14, 1955, it achieved full membership in the United Nations itself, as part of a broader package deal that also brought in Portugal, Finland, and several Soviet-aligned states. Yet historians have long debated who truly benefited most from this arrangement, and the disagreement is not a minor footnote. The Spanish historian Julio Gil Pacharaman has argued that Spanish politicians and military officers quickly came to feel like junior partners in the relationship, receiving what he characterized as little more than crumbs of aid relative to what they had hoped for, even as Spain had no real alternative but to lean on this powerful protector to keep the regime afloat. The American historian Stanley Payne offered a somewhat more favorable reading, suggesting the relationship bolstered Franco's image both domestically and abroad, validating his decades-long insistence that Spain's anti-communism would eventually be rewarded by the West. Both readings agree on one underlying truth: domestic opposition to the agreement existed inside Spain even under a dictatorship that suppressed open dissent, with critics viewing the arrangement as deeply asymmetrical and warning that it risked entangling Spain in conflicts dictated entirely by Washington's interests, not Madrid's. American critics, for their part, were equally uneasy. Voices such as Harold Ickes, Franklin Roosevelt's former Secretary of the Interior, publicly described Franco as a mimic of Hitler whose regime choked its own people, and progressive publications coordinated public campaigns urging the United States to maintain Spain's diplomatic isolation rather than reward it. What makes the 1953 pact historically pivotal is not simply that it happened, but what it represented. The moment ideological purity in American foreign policy gave way decisively to the cold mathematics of Cold War geography. For Franco, it was vindication after a decade in the wilderness. For Washington, it was a calculated trade of moral discomfort for strategic depth. And for the people of Spain, living under a regime with no electoral accountability, it was a bargain struck entirely above their heads, one that would tie their nation's fate to American military strategy for the rest of the century, long after Franco himself had died and the world he built had been swept away. A regime built on a foundation of foreign aid is, by definition, a regime perpetually renegotiating its own survival, and the 2 decades following the Pacts of Madrid were defined by that recurring cycle of renewal, friction, and gradual recalibration. The original 1953 agreements were never meant to be permanent, they required periodic extension, and each renewal became an occasion for both sides to recalculate what they wanted from the other. A renewal in 1963 extended the basing arrangement while modestly adjusting the terms of American aid, and another followed in 1968, as the strategic environment of the Cold War continued shifting beneath both governments. By this point, the character of the relationship had become unmistakably lopsided in the eyes of many Spanish officials and citizens. The United States had what it wanted most, basing rights along the Strait of Gibraltar, in the heart of Spain, and in the strategically positioned Canary Islands, while Spain still lacked the one thing it had requested from the very beginning, a true, binding mutual defense treaty that would obligate the United States to come to Spain's aid in the event of an attack. Instead, Spain remained locked out of NATO entirely, kept at arm's length by Western European democracies who, even as their armies trained alongside Americans stationed on Spanish soil, refused to grant Franco's dictatorship the legitimacy of full alliance membership. This contradiction reached its clearest articulation in 1976, a year after Franco's death, when the United States and Spain signed the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation. Unlike the executive agreements of 1953, this 1976 treaty carried more formal weight and reflected a Spain that was visibly beginning to change. Franco had died in November 1975, ending nearly 4 decades of dictatorial rule, and King Juan Carlos I had assumed the role of head of state, opening the door to a transition toward democracy that the world watched with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The 1976 treaty broadened cooperation beyond the narrow basing arrangements of the 1950s, but the underlying asymmetry that Spanish strategists had long resented remained essentially intact. American forces retained access to Spanish facilities, while Spain still possessed no formal collective security guarantee comparable to what NATO members enjoyed. The transition to democracy, once underway, moved with remarkable speed and considerable courage. Adolfo Suárez, first elected Prime Minister in 1976, approached the question of NATO membership with deliberate caution, wary of deep divisions within his own governing coalition over the continued American use of Spanish bases. Spain adopted a new democratic constitution in December 1978, and the country joined the Council of Europe in 1977, signaling its determination to rejoin the community of Western democracies after decades of isolation. Then, in February 1981, following a failed military coup attempt that briefly threatened to derail the entire democratic experiment, Leopoldo Calvo Sotelo became prime minister and campaigned forcefully for NATO accession, partly as a strategy to strengthen civilian control over a military that had just demonstrated its capacity for insurrection. His campaign succeeded. On May 29, 1982, the Spanish Parliament approved NATO membership by a simple majority vote, and Spain formally joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that same month, nearly 3 decades after the original Pax of Madrid had first tied Spanish and American defense planning together informally. Joining NATO, however, did not settle the underlying political argument inside Spain, it merely moved that argument onto a new stage. The Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, known by its initials PSOE, had campaigned vigorously against NATO membership throughout the negotiations, framing accession as another instance of Spain surrendering sovereignty to American strategic interests. Anti-NATO rallies drew large crowds in Madrid as early as November 1981, demanding the dismantling of American bases outright, and by 1983 Spanish peace organizations had coordinated with broader European movements opposing the deployment of American Pershing II and cruise missiles across the continent. Then came one of the great ironies of Spanish democratic politics. In October 1982, the PSOE swept to power in Spain's general election, becoming the first socialist government in the nation's history, led by Felipe González, and having campaigned explicitly on a promise to reconsider NATO membership and hold a popular referendum on the question. Once in office, González performed what historians have since described as a striking pro-Atlantic reversal, ultimately deciding to keep Spain inside NATO, subject to specific conditions that he laid out in a Decalogue on Peace and Security Policy, presented to Parliament in October 1984. The promised referendum finally took place on March 12, 1986, asking Spanish voters whether the country should remain in the Atlantic Alliance under 3 explicit conditions: that Spain would not join NATO's integrated military command structure, that nuclear weapons would never be stored or installed on Spanish soil, and that the American military presence in Spain would be progressively reduced over time. The result favored remaining in NATO by a margin of roughly 13 percentage points nationally, though the no vote actually won majorities in Catalonia, the Basque Country, Navarre, and the Canary Islands, exposing deep regional and political fault lines that persist in Spanish politics to this day. Survey research conducted afterward by Spain's Center for Sociological Research found that a meaningful share of yes voters, roughly 17%, said they had only supported continued membership because of those specific restrictive conditions attached to the question, suggesting the victory was won less on enthusiasm for NATO itself than on comfort with the limits placed around it. Academic analyses of the vote have since shown that the referendum functioned largely as a proxy verdict on the socialist government's broader record, with most support coming from loyal past PSOE voters and a portion of conservatives, even as nearly a third of 1982 socialist voters defected to vote against the government's own position. By the time the dust settled on the 1986 referendum, Spain had completed an extraordinary transformation in barely a decade, from an isolated dictatorship excluded from every major Western institution, to a parliamentary democracy fully integrated into NATO, with a referendum-validated mandate from its own citizens. The American bases that had once been symbols of a dictator's desperate bargain for survival were now, officially, Spain's own contribution to the collective defense of the West, though the nuclear restrictions and force reduction conditions baked into the 1986 referendum made clear that Spanish democracy intended to set its own terms for that contribution, rather than simply inheriting Franco's arrangement unchanged. The relationship had survived the death of the dictator who created it, but it had also been permanently transformed by the democracy that replaced him, a tension between strategic necessity and popular sovereignty that would continue resurfacing for decades to come. By the late 1980s, the strategic equation that had defined Spanish-American relations since 1953 needed a fundamental rewrite, and in 1988 it got one. The new Agreement on Defense Cooperation replaced the old executive agreement structure with a more comprehensive framework, and it arrived alongside a significant concession that Spanish nationalists had been demanding for years: a reduction in American troop levels. American forces stationed in Spain, which had climbed to roughly 12,000 personnel by the 1980s, were cut by approximately 40% as part of the 1988 accord, with the historic air base at Torrejon, just outside Madrid, eventually closing to American fighter operations altogether. This was no longer the relationship of an isolated dictator desperate for any foreign patron. It was a negotiation between a now fully democratic Spain, secure in its NATO membership and confident enough to push back on the terms of its own territory. The 1988 agreement would itself be amended repeatedly over the following decades, but its basic architecture, governing American access specifically to Naval Station Rota and Moron Air Base, remains, even now, the legal foundation underpinning the entire bilateral defense relationship. The 1990s brought a new kind of test, one that revealed just how thoroughly Spain's bases had become woven into the machinery of American global power projection, even as Spanish governments tried to draw their own lines around how that machinery could be used. During the 1991 Gulf War, the bases at Rota and Moron served as critical logistics nodes for American operations, a role that continued quietly through the decade as American forces used Spanish facilities to support missions stretching from the Balkans to the Middle East without generating the kind of domestic controversy that would later erupt over Iraq. Spain's economy, meanwhile, was undergoing its own transformation, joining the European Economic Community in 1986 and gradually shedding the image of a peripheral, underdeveloped corner of Europe. American direct investment flowed steadily into the country, accounting for between 10 and 50% of all foreign direct investment into Spain in various years since 1997, with the United States representing the single largest source of net direct investment into the Spanish economy in 2002 alone. The defense relationship and the economic relationship were becoming, by the turn of the millennium, genuinely intertwined rather than simply parallel tracks. Then came the rupture that anti-Americanism researchers still cite as the defining crisis of the modern era, the Iraq War. In 2002 and into 2003, Spanish Prime Minister José María Aznar, leader of the center-right Popular Party, made a deliberate strategic bet that closer alignment with Washington would elevate Spain's standing on the world stage. Aznar joined the so-called Coalition of the Willing, contributing approximately 1,300 troops to the American and British-led invasion of Iraq that began on March 19, 2003. The political gamble could not have been more poorly timed with Spanish public sentiment. Polling at the time found roughly 90% of Spaniards opposed to the war, the highest level of opposition recorded anywhere in Europe, yet Aznar pressed forward anyway, betting that a tighter bilateral relationship with Washington would eventually pay strategic and economic dividends that Spanish voters would come to appreciate. Aznar's intellectual circle spent the autumn of 2003 and winter of 2004 quietly drafting blueprints for what they hoped would become a genuine renaissance in Spanish-American relations, anticipating that his expected successor, Mariano Rajoy, would inherit and build upon this new closeness. History intervened with brutal abruptness. 3 days before the March 14, 2004 general election that Aznar's party had been widely forecast to win, an al-Qaeda-linked cell detonated bombs on commuter trains in Madrid, killing 191 people. Spanish voters, in unprecedented numbers, turned against the incumbent government and elected the socialist challenger, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, who had campaigned explicitly on a promise to withdraw Spanish troops from Iraq. Zapatero did not hesitate. The decision to bring Spanish forces home was effectively made in the narrow window between his election victory on March 14 and his formal inauguration on April 18, facilitated by discreet diplomatic groundwork already laid by his future defense and foreign ministers. The Spanish government ordered the withdrawal on April 18, 2004, and it was completed by the end of June that year. The reaction from Washington was sharp and personal. American Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had already grouped countries like France and Germany into a dismissive category he called "Old Europe," and Spain's defection from the coalition fed directly into that narrative. In a pointed diplomatic snub, the American ambassador in Madrid boycotted Spain's October 12, 2004 National Military Parade after Zapatero had remained seated during the 2003 ceremony, while President George W. Bush extended an invitation to the defeated Aznar as the first foreign dignitary received at the White House following the November 2004 American election, and reportedly never returned Zapatero's own congratulatory phone call after that same election. What is genuinely remarkable, and frequently overlooked in popular retellings of this episode, is how narrowly the crisis was contained. Scholars studying the period have noted that even amid the diplomatic rupture, Zapatero never once raised the possibility of denying the United States continued blanket access to Rota and Moron for ongoing Iraq war operations, and his own Socialist Party members never pushed him to do so. Anti-war demonstrations took place outside both bases in the run-up to the invasion, but contemporary press coverage characterized these protests as broadly anti-war rather than specifically anti-base, a distinction that mattered enormously for the durability of the underlying defense architecture. The bases themselves, in other words, survived the worst political crisis in decades between the two governments completely intact, even as the personal relationship between Madrid and Washington soured dramatically. The United States did register its displeasure economically, however. In the summer of 2004, American defense officials froze consideration of a previous Aznar-era request to relocate the 6th Fleet's homeport from Naples to Rota, shelving a planned $150 million investment in facility upgrades that would have included contracts with Spain's Azar shipyard and potentially rescued thousands of Spanish jobs. The post-Iraq decade brought a quieter but no less significant evolution: Spain's transformation from a peripheral basing arrangement into the literal front line of NATO's ballistic missile defense architecture. On October 5, 2011, U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta stood alongside NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen and Spanish President José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, the same leader who had pulled troops from Iraq 7 years earlier, to announce a new strategic initiative under the European Phased Adaptive Approach. 4 Aegis-equipped American destroyers, capable of intercepting ballistic missiles, would be forward homeport at Naval Station Rota, providing missile defense coverage for the European continent against potential threats from Iran and other actors. The first ships transferred to Rota in 2014 and 2015, eventually including the USS Arleigh Burke, USS Ross, USS Porter, and USS Roosevelt, with roughly 1,100 American military personnel and their families relocating to the base. Zapatero, announcing the arrangement, called it a gesture of trust for our armed forces, and noted the positive economic impact the program would have on the Rota region, generating an estimated 1,000 local jobs. The symbolism was difficult to miss. The very government that had defied Washington over Iraq was now hosting some of the most advanced missile defense warships in the American arsenal, a testament to how deeply institutionalized, and how genuinely valued by Spanish military planners, the underlying defense partnership had become, regardless of which party controlled the government in Madrid or how loudly the two nations occasionally disagreed. If the early 2010s saw Spain quietly deepen its role inside NATO's missile shield, the years following 2022 would test that role more severely than at any point since the Iraq War, and ultimately push the entire bilateral relationship into the most serious crisis of its 70-year history. The catalyst arrived on February 24, 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, instantly transforming European security calculations and giving fresh urgency to every NATO basing arrangement on the continent. Within months, the alliance gathered for its June 2022 summit in Madrid itself, a symbolically loaded choice of venue, and one of the concrete outcomes to emerge from that meeting was an agreement between President Joe Biden and Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez to expand the American destroyer presence at Naval Station Rota from 4 ships to 6, alongside an additional 600 American troops. The formal agreement implementing that expansion was signed in May 2023 by the American ambassador to Spain and the Spanish defense minister, who described the agreement on defense cooperation not merely as a security document but, in her words, as a reflection of a relationship built on shared belief in democracy, human rights, and the international rules-based order. A 5th Aegis destroyer, the USS Oscar Austin, arrived at Rota in October 2024, with a 6th to follow, cementing Spain's position as one of the most consequential single nodes in NATO's layered ballistic missile defense network, capable of intercepting threats across the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the North Atlantic. Throughout this period, Spain also demonstrated tangible commitment to the broader Western response to Russian aggression, contributing more than $1.64 billion in military assistance and roughly $900 million in financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, while hosting more than 259,000 Ukrainian refugees and deploying its own forces to NATO missions in Latvia, Romania, and Slovakia. And yet beneath this surface of robust cooperation, a structural fault line was widening, one rooted in a dispute over money rather than missiles. At NATO's June 2025 summit in The Hague, the alliance's 32 members confronted an American-driven push, championed forcefully by President Donald Trump's administration, to commit every member nation to spending 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. Split between 3.5% for core military capability and 1.5% for related infrastructure and cyber needs. Every single NATO member accepted this target except one, Spain. Prime Minister Sanchez, in a pointed letter to NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, argued that the 5% figure would be, in his words, unreasonable and counterproductive, insisting Spain could fulfill all of its alliance capability commitments while capping its own defense budget at approximately 2.1% of GDP. After days of tense negotiation that officials feared might derail the entire Hague Summit declaration, Spain secured a unique exemption, becoming the sole holdout in an alliance otherwise unified on the new spending trajectory, with a formal review of Spain's progress scheduled for 2029. Sanchez framed the decision domestically as a matter of strategic autonomy and fiscal responsibility, arguing that rushing toward 5% would only deepen Spain's dependence on foreign, implicitly American, defense suppliers, while undermining the country's capacity to fund its welfare state. President Trump's reaction was sharp and personal. In October 2025 he publicly branded Spain a very low payer, suggested the alliance ought to consider expelling the country altogether, and explicitly threatened trade retaliation through tariffs. Analysts at institutions including the Atlantic Council noted that the episode had already produced diplomatic costs beyond rhetoric, with Spain notably excluded from an August 2025 White House gathering of key European leaders on Ukraine policy, a visible marker, in the eyes of many observers, of Spain's diminished standing among its closest allies. This spending dispute, serious as it was, proved to be only a prelude. The true rupture came in February and March of 2026. When the United States launched a military campaign against Iran in coordination with Israeli strikes that, according to reporting at the time, resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. As American forces moved to mobilize support across their global network of bases, Spain made a decision with few precedents in the history of the alliance. It formally refused to allow the United States to use the joint installations at Naval Station Rota and Moron Air Base for any operations connected to the strikes on Iran, and it closed Spanish airspace to aircraft involved in the campaign. Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares stated plainly that Spanish bases will not be used for anything that falls outside the agreement with the United States and the United Nations Charter, arguing that the bilateral agreement on defense cooperation, the same 1988 framework that had governed the relationship since the end of the Cold War, simply did not authorize this particular use of Spanish territory, and that the underlying military action violated international law. Within days, Flight Radar 24 tracking data confirmed that American aircraft, including refueling tankers, had begun repositioning out of Rota and Moron toward Ramstein Air Base in Germany and bases in southern France, a visible, public signal that the diplomatic dispute had real operational consequences for American force posture in the region. Prime Minister Sanchez, addressing the crisis directly, drew an explicit historical parallel that would not have been lost on anyone familiar with the deeper arc of this relationship. He warned that the Iran campaign risked dragging the world into another costly military quagmire in the Middle East, similar to the past American interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. A direct echo of the very same argument Zapatero had used to justify withdrawing Spanish troops from Iraq more than 2 decades earlier. In short, Sanchez said, summarizing his government's position in 4 words, no to the war. President Trump's response escalated rapidly. He branded Spain very bad and terrible, declared, "I'm not happy with Spain," and threatened to cut off all trade with them, even insisting at one point that the United States could simply disregard Spanish objections entirely. "We could use their base if we want. We could just fly in and use it. Nobody's going to tell us not to use it." Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went further still, arguing that Spain's refusal to grant access endangered American lives, and that the Spanish put American lives at risk. The dispute briefly descended into outright contradiction between the two governments, when a White House spokesperson claimed Madrid had agreed to assist American operations, only for Foreign Minister Albares to flatly refute the statement on Spanish radio, declaring that Spain's position has not changed one iota. The economic stakes underlying this confrontation were genuinely significant. Bilateral trade in goods and services between Spain and the United States totaled nearly $75 billion annually, with a trade surplus of almost $3 billion favoring the United States, alongside more than $121 billion in two-way direct investment and 86,500 jobs supported on American soil by Spanish companies alone. It remained legally and practically unclear how a unilateral American tariff regime against a single European Union member state would even function, given that trade policy for all 27 EU members is negotiated collectively by Brussels. A complication underscored when the EU stated it would work to protect its interests and stabilize the broader trade relationship negotiated with Washington the previous year. Yet the symbolism of the threat, leveling economic punishment against a NATO ally and host nation over a basing dispute, marked a qualitative escalation beyond even the bitter recriminations of the 2004 Iraq withdrawal crisis, when American retaliation had been limited to shelving a single shipyard investment rather than threatening the entire trading relationship. Compounding the tension, this Iran basing dispute did not occur in isolation. It followed Sanchez's open criticism of Israel's campaign in Gaza and his government's recognition of a Palestinian state in May 2024, his administration's reported opposition to a separate American operation targeting Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and a pattern of Spanish foreign policy that analysts increasingly described as a deliberate diversification away from Washington. Sanchez visited China 4 times in 4 years, traveling to Beijing shortly after the Trump administration announced tariffs on the European Union in April 2025 to conclude new trade and cooperation agreements, while King Felipe VI made his own state visit to China in November 2025, accompanied by additional economic accords. For Spain's domestic electorate, this posture appeared to carry real political value. Polling suggested Sanchez's positions on Gaza, Palestine, and the Iran war aligned with broadly popular sentiment at home, even as they widened the gulf separating Madrid from Washington. Congressional analysts in the United States, reviewing the totality of these developments, the Iran basing dispute, the NATO spending standoff, a separate Spanish rejection of American F-35 fighter jets, and the deepening engagement with Beijing, characterized the situation as a pattern of alliance drift, warning that the strategic partnership which had anchored American force posture in the Mediterranean for more than 4 decades was, for the first time since Franco's death, being tested in ways that could not simply be papered over with another renewed agreement. Whether this represents a temporary rupture, born of a single contested war and a uniquely confrontational American administration, or a more durable strategic realignment, remains for history to determine. But the underlying truth that the entire 70-year relationship illustrates has not changed. Spain's geography still matters enormously to American strategy, and that leverage runs, however unevenly, in both directions.